Good evening, everyone. This is Dawn. Thank you for joining this webinar brought to you by ASQ Innovation Division. The topic of tonight's webinar is Systems Engineering. The information will cover a customer need and walk the participants through the systems engineering methodology of requirements generation and validation, which is all done prior to development, with a tie-in to when innovation comes into play in the process. The learning objectives are: attendees will get an understanding about the importance of focusing on a customer problem, what systems engineering is and why it's important, what a good requirement is, why that is important, how to validate requirements using some quality tools. Please note that this webinar is recorded, and the recording will be available on ASQ Innovation Division YouTube channel. Also, there will be 5 to 10 minutes time after the presentation for questions and answers. Please post your questions on the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. Tonight, our speaker is Lori Williams. Thank you very much, Lori, for accepting to be our speaker tonight. Lori Williams is a 30-year member of ASQ and has spent that time in multiple roles leading quality initiatives, process improvement teams, and driving quality solutions to the customer. She is an ASQ CQE, CQA, CSSBB, and CQMOE, a certified Apollo RCA instructor, certified as an RCA leader, lead auditor, and MBB through General Electric's quality certification program. Lori is the engineering leader for the Systems Engineering and System Test and Validation team at Bentley, Nevada. Now, I'd like to hand over to our speaker, Lori Williams. Lori, please take it away.
All right, thanks, Dawn. Well, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the ASQ Innovation Division and the webinar on systems engineering. I planned a simple agenda for us to give you a bit of insight into the wonderful world of systems engineering. I'll start a little bit with my background, talk about the importance of understanding the customer problem, explain what systems engineering is, cover the importance of good requirements, then discuss how you could validate your requirements with a couple of simple tools. We'll start with just a little bit about me. So I've spent the last 30 years working first for TRW as a manufacturing engineer, then as a quality engineer. After that, I went to Northern Nevada, moved there to the Bentley, Nevada business, which was acquired by General Electric in 2002. It's now part of the Baker Hughes, a GE company. I've held a variety of roles, both in and outside of quality, including sourcing, finance, quality leadership, master black belt, product line management, global audit, and as Dawn had said, my current role is the engineering leader for our systems engineering and system test and validation team. In addition to that, I'm what's called an innovation coach, or for GE, they call us FastWorks coaches, where we mentor and coach the product development teams to get successful outcomes. So innovation is a tricky path. You must first make sure that you're focusing on something that has a market need. Or if you're really awesome, take for example Apple and the iPad, you can create your own market need. So the topics I'm going to cover on this slide, they were derived from a book by David Kidder called The Lean Startup. They're an excellent guide to use for determining whether or not you should proceed with an idea. So first, you need to understand what the customer problem or pain point is that you're focused on. Is it a universal problem? Is it something that many people are experienced with or are interested in? So understanding the customer problem is one of the most critical steps in the process. And it's where much of the systems engineering requirements management and gathering focuses. It's also one of the areas where, if not truly understood, can cause a lot of people to fail with their innovations. The second critical point is market potential, and this is a big one. If you have an innovative solution, is it a solution that people are willing to pay for? Can you provide a solution that will actually make money, or is it a $10 solution to a $5 problem? The other part of that then is understanding the competitive landscape. If there are a lot of competitors who are successfully competing in that market space, then do you really want to go there? So I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Dollar Shave Club. Michael Dubin, who was the innovator of that, had an idea, and he had a very inexpensive startup with that. The simple premise was that people grow hair, right? Some people don't like hair, and therefore they need a simple, convenient solution to remove that hair, hence shaving. So what better solution than to ship razors of your choice in quantity and choice in the level of quality directly to your home at a competitive price? So at the time this was launched, I believe it was 2013, Gillette had 71% share of the market. Schick was a distant second. Both of those are pretty reputable brands, right? And the Dollar Shave Club has taken a significant amount of market share from Gillette. And in 2017, Michael sold that startup to Unilever for $1 billion. Very short time span between when he started and when he sold it for $1 billion. So his success, it was quick, and part of that was due to the perfect blend of all the critical points on this slide. Pain point, market potential, competitive landscape. He led with how he brought it to market. The next one, subject matter expertise, he certainly had subject matter expertise. He's a male. Most males shave if they're clean shaven. So the thing with subject matter expertise is, do you know and understand the market that you're targeting? And if you don't have that expertise, can you partner with somebody who does? And finding that is a critical point in augmenting your own experience with someone who's got that experience. Then the next critical part is start small. So take the time to know if you'll be successful by what I call testing the water. Understand what you can and cannot afford to lose. Take the time to test your theories and hypotheses, focusing on what assumptions you are making that must be true for your product to be successful. And take the time to define what those assumptions are that you're making. So let's say, for example, you want to start a coffee shop, right? So you're going to do a coffee shop and you're not sure if you've picked the right location. The assumption is that people want coffee, that they'll buy your coffee, and that the location you've selected will have sufficient customers. So how would you start small on that, right? Not by investing tens of thousands of dollars in opening up a full store. You could invest a few $1,000s on a portable coffee kiosk or booth, set it up on the sidewalk or even inside a store, right? And then test out the customer demand. If there's not enough demand to be successful, then you've really only lost a few $1,000s. Think about restaurants, stores, or shops in the town or city that you live in. How many of them go out of business in the first couple years, right? Imagine the investment in the commissioning and then decommissioning that they incurred in opening that. It's probably a staggering amount. So remember this simple statistic, and this is per publicity.com. Of the 30,000 new consumer products launched annually, about 95% of them fail. It's a bit less in the grocery sector, where about 70 to 80% fail, but that's still really high. So that's where that start small comes into play. You really want to make sure that you have a good idea that your assumptions are right before you jump in with both feet and go to a pretty significant expenditure. So how can you minimize your risk and increase your chances for success? Well, systems engineering is a great starting point. So take a quick scan of the definitions on this slide, and then we'll talk about it. So the main takeaway that you should have gotten from these definitions is that systems engineering is a methodical approach to product development with the intent of driving for successful product releases and innovations. So how does systems engineering help? Well, first, it starts with requirements. There are several different types of requirements. Some of the key ones are noted here, which we'll talk about a little further. Not explicitly stated on this slide, but buried in the requirements noted are implementation requirements, which are the hows for the technology team during the development. I'm not going to cover the implementation as it's a topic all to itself in getting all of the internal requirements for business success. There's also the validated requirements, which we'll talk about that as we go as well. So let's start with looking at operational scenarios. So these are basic scenarios that reflect how a customer may use, interface with, or interact with a product. And I'm going to give you an example. Think of a shopping cart, right? That's the cart that you use when you go to the grocery store. An operational scenario could be as follows. So you're an adult male, you drive to the grocery store, you park your car, you walk into the market, and you collect a grocery cart. You wash the cart with the little disinfecting wipes, and then you begin to shop. You bring your reusable shopping bags and place them in the front section of the cart where you would typically put a child if you had brought one with you. As you shop, you place items in the cart with larger items on the bottom. You purchase fruits, vegetables, bread, meats, eggs, cereal, dairy product, and some beverages. You are very specific about where you place the products in the cart because some of them are damaged easily. You would like to place them where you stored your bags. However, that space is already taken with your bags, which you need to provide to the cashier first thing, so those need to be accessible. Okay, so now with the way I've written that scenario, there's a lot of opportunity to look at solutions or product or process changes to make the overall shopping experience better. But you start with that operational scenario to really set the stage. The next part is system requirements, and that's looking at the entire solution. So using our shopping operational scenario, right, with the shopping cart, you would consider not only the cart, but can also look at the other parts of the experience. The bags, the checkout, the location of the items in the store, right? The configuration of the cart, right? So the sky is really the limit for where you could go on your system requirements. Then next we have functional requirements. So what does your shopping cart need to do? So here's some examples, right? It shall hold the items for purchase while shopping. It shall allow the customer to easily move around the store. it shall have a space to place a child up to 40 pounds. So those are just some examples of what could be functional requirements for your shopping cart. The functional requirements, as I read those, hopefully you notice that they are the most customer-facing. And if an innovator gets those parts wrong, it's really hard to be successful with your product, because without customers, your product's not going to sell. Performance requirements, which are what we call the ILITs, is where you hit reliability, usability, serviceability, manufacturability, responsiveness, things like that, where they're a little bit harder to get your arms around because they're not like your functional requirements of exactly what the product must do. Some examples of getting your performance requirements are done by asking some very simple questions. So how long should the cart last? How smoothly should the cart roll? How often do you change the tires? So by asking those simple questions, that brings about the answers that would hit the reliability, the usability, those different ILITs that are on the screen. So once you have a good start on your requirements, then you need to validate those requirements. What would you look at when you validate requirements? You'd want to look at context, testability, and whether they are implementable are really good starting points to validate your requirements from. Here's another example, again, using our shopping cart. So the cart shall accommodate up to 200 pounds of merchandise. To really understand this, you would need to know what type of merchandise, right? Because 200 pounds of beverages will take up significantly less space than 200 pounds of, let's say, cosmetics, right? So let's go to the next slide for a little bit more information on good requirements. When performing the validation, you want to start with context. That's your best starting point, because context is critical to understanding where the requirement writer, so the originator, the person who's creating that requirement, is coming from. So imagine how often you can take something out of context when you read it in an email or when you hear it on the news. Having the right context can help to identify what the real requirement is and what the real need is. A requirement without context can easily be misunderstood or misinterpreted. The next critical area is testability. So one of the critical areas where products fail is the lack of a quality solution. You can't test quality into a solution. However, if you drive for testability in your requirements, you can leverage the concepts of test-driven development, which in itself drives built-in quality. It's a great leverage point that quality professionals can use to drive quality into the product. Think about how you would test the shopping cart based on the operational scenario or the basic functional requirements. Shall hold the items for purchase while shopping. So would you simulate that? Or if you were a manufacturer of shopping carts, what would your test lab look like to validate that it should hold items for purchase while shopping? I visualized a test lab that is set up almost like a grocery store. Everything with shelves lined with product, how wide the shelves are from one to the next, so you know how wide your shopping cart needs to be. The next one, shall allow the customer to easily move around the store. For this requirement, I'd look at kind of a virtual reality using a simulated shopping experience. Everything virtualized to scale, right? Shall have a space to place a child up to 40 pounds. So for this requirement, I kind of think about the crash test dummy, right, where you fit the person in the space, because it makes you think about the completeness of the requirement. How would you set the child in the spot? How would the feet be secured? How would the hands be secured? Do they have the ability to turn around? Would you expect clips or some sort of attachment mechanism for a seat holder? So as you think about that, hopefully that makes you think about, how would I test a product? How would I take those requirements and see, does my product meet them? So the next one is implementable. So how often do you have a great idea, however there's no way to implement it or create a solution that you could implement? I'm going to use a workplace example for this one. So let's say that the requirement is all meetings must start no later than 1 minute of the scheduled start time. So I'm sure many of you have meetings, and frequently they're back-to-back meetings, where one meeting ends at, let's say, 2 o'clock, and you have another one that starts at 2 o'clock. If your meetings are also in 2 different conference rooms, which means walking time from one location to another, that makes it very difficult to make it within 1 minute of the starting time. So do you leave the first meeting early to make it to the second meeting on time? Or do you stay for the entire first meeting and arrive late to the second meeting, right? So again, the requirement we're looking at is all meetings must start no later than 1 minute of the scheduled start time. So what if you wanted to stop all meetings at the 45-minute mark or start all meetings at the 15-minute mark? Microsoft Outlook, which is one of the most popular business calendar management applications, right, requires a manual input of any meeting start or stop time that's other than on the hour or on the half hour. Additionally, people would need to be consistent on which one they choose. It's either start 15 minutes after or end 15 minutes before. So that being said, how implementable is the requirement identified of all meetings must start no later than 1 minute after the scheduled start time? Not very implementable, just based on some of the constraints that I just talked about. So as we look at that then, let's think about what would make a requirement good. And I like to call it the 3 C's: capability, characteristic, or constraint. So capability, what does the solution need to do? Characteristic is what characteristics does the solution need to have? And constraints, what are the constraints in technology, organizational limitations, or the similar that the solution must accommodate? So now take a basic requirement, take the basic requirement qualifiers, and together with those 3 C's, you can see what makes a requirement a good requirement. Take verifiable, right? Is it something that you can verify through measurement, inspection, analysis, test, demonstration, and how would you do it? And what proof do you need to show that it was done? For necessary, is it essential, right? That means it must trace back to a customer need. It's the customer needs where there's business value. So necessary is very critical to make sure you've got business value. And ambiguous. So writers, reviewers, developers, and testers need to interpret that requirement the same way. For example, the product shall only display 1 record at a time. That's a very clear requirement, very hard to misinterpret that or interpret it differently. Then we have singular and concise. So only includes 1 capability or 1 characteristic or 1 constraint. It needs to be very clear and very succinct. Then correct. So correct would interpret a higher level requirement or scenario and spells it out so that it can be implemented correctly. And some of these, it'll seem like there's a little bit of overlap, but again, if you take each one and look at it and measure your requirements against that, it will help you understand whether or not you have a good requirement. So complete, right? Complete would be where it doesn't require reference out to any other requirements, standards, etc. So an example of that would be the system shall meet the requirements of standard XYZ, right? That's a very poor requirement because you would have to go out to that other requirement and get information there. So if you wanted to make that complete enough, you would have to list both the version or revision of the standard, the exact section, paragraph, etc., to make it very clear of what that requirement is. And then finally, feasible. And this is where the reality check occurs, right? Can you actually satisfy the requirements within the constraints of the organization? And constraints could be cost, facility, time, resources, anything like that to help drive whether or not it's feasible. So let's look at a couple tools that you could use to help see if you have sufficient or good requirements. We're going to start with the QFD, or Quality Function Deployment, sometimes called a House of Quality. And this is really just another use for a very powerful quality tool. And here's how we would fill in the information when we're talking about doing requirements. So on the left axis, you would list the customer requirements, which is the what. And this is where the 3 C's come in, the capability, characteristic, or constraint. On the top axis, you would list the how by translating the what into technical requirements. Next, you'd look at the relationship between the what's and the how's to determine if you have a strong, moderate, or weak relationship. So you can further elaborate on the lower axis with the target values that become measurable criteria for validation of the requirements. You can compare known competitor products on these same technical requirements, as well as provide a weighting for how important those technical requirements are to the success of your product. Then on the right axis, you can identify the target values for your what, and similar to the hows, you can compare that with known competitors. So again, a lot to see on this slide, but really powerful in how you lay it out. So let's look at an example. Let's use the example of a lawnmower. So if you are the end user, what would be important to you for a lawnmower? And think about it, if you were going to go out and buy a lawnmower, what would you look for? What would be the criteria that's important to you? Or if you're a manufacturer, what would be important to you as a manufacturer to make it either easier to manufacture, less expensive to manufacture, or improve your repeatability? And then if you're a reseller or a service technician, what are the things that would be important to you to make it easier for you or a better experience? So as noted on the previous slide, right, what are your needs from a capability, characteristic, or constraint? That's what you would be putting on that axis. Then think about it from the design engineer's perspective. How do you take the information and come up with the hows? So this information is based upon very high-level descriptions, as you can see for what's on the screen. The level of detail can vary and can increase if you break the QFD into sub-QFDs. For example, pull all the manufacturer or all the resale service needs into separate QFDs. You could create multiple levels and go into greater detail on each one. So once you have that filled out for the hows, then you look for correlations. And that is where you see the numbers on the screen, right? So correlations let you see where you may have a solution that either has no requirement or where you have a requirement that has no solution. So in this case, if we continued to complete the relationship scoring, we would probably put a 9 under the backwards compatible column and the interchangeable parts row. So if you can see that on the screen, right? And then in the end, the self-inflating tires, they really don't have a what, unless you want to say there's a weak correlation between that and robust construction. So if you did that, you would put a 1 in the little box there that is self-inflating tires where it intersects with robust construction. So if you were looking at the how much sections, you could ask, and this is the right side, what? How fuel efficient does it need to be? How large or small of a mechanism to catch the lawn? How many lawn lengths or lawn heights? So it's a great way to help identify options, which again, options add cost. So if cost is a constraint, it'll let you know, hey, I need to really narrow down what I have there for my different options. On the how section, take backwards compatible. So how many versions or models back do you want to go for spare parts? And again, that's all about cost. So as noted earlier, it's a great tool to use for mapping out your solutions to your innovation ideas, and also analyzing if your requirements are complete or appropriate. It's also a great way to build consensus and get ideas from others. As building a QFD, it's a team sport. It should never be done by just one person on their own without collaboration from other teams. It also should never be done without some form of customer input, commercial input, and the teams that have the knowledge to understand what's needed and how could we do it. So let's look at another tool that we could use, which is a rubric. A rubric is one of the simplest tools to use and often a very forgotten tool that's very powerful. It helps because it shows you what good looks like. You can take the different characteristics I shared with you earlier. In this example, I'm showing verifiable, singular and concise, and unambiguous, provided an explanation of what those characteristics mean, and then provide an example of good or bad. So let's take the verifiable example. In this case, it should be structured so that the capability, characteristic, or constraint can be verified to the stakeholder's satisfaction. The good example is a simple statement that the lawnmower shall have removable blades. That statement, without the context, is clear, but not as verifiable as when you add that context. When you look at the bad example, it leaves many unanswered questions. For singular and concise, you're looking for a single statement that doesn't combine multiple requirements. The good example makes it clear what is meant by capable of mowing lawn to multiple heights. The bad example is combining two different requirements, lawn height and self-propelled. For unambiguous, you're looking to remove any ambiguity from the requirements so that it can only be interpreted in one way. For the good example, it tells you that the receptacle is used as mowing occurs. For the bad example, you could theoretically meet that by having an unattached receptacle where you would have to pick up your lawn clippings and throw them in after mowing. It's an entirely different solution to the requirement. So if you wanted a great test for unambiguous, ask multiple people to interpret your requirement and see how varied the responses are. So one of the most powerful things about a rubric is that it helps the team to self-evaluate their requirements to determine if they need to be modified. It's a great tool for the person not only doing the requirements verification, but also for the person writing the requirements. So hopefully you now have a better understanding of requirements and what makes a good requirement and the need to focus your innovation activities on a customer need. So let's look at a few products where the manufacturer or developer either did or did not hit the mark. And again, as I go through these, think about capability, think about characteristics, and think about constraints. So let's start with Windows Vista, right? This was the replacement product for Windows XP, launched in 2007. There were functionality issues, compatibility issues, significant user dissatisfaction. And what's interesting is this product had user testing, it had a lot of development on it to where all indications were that it should have been highly successful. It was a terrible product and did not last out on the market very long at all. It was quickly replaced. Let's take another one, Goober peanut butter and jelly, right? So wouldn't it be great to only open one jar of stuff, right, when you want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? It's still sold today with generic offerings by some grocers, but it's really, in my opinion, it's lacking. So what about chunky peanut butter? Not everybody likes creamy peanut butter. What about users who like more peanut butter on their sandwich than jelly, or more jelly than peanut butter? So it's very controlled in the exact amounts of what you can pull. I would imagine when customers are finished with their Goober peanut butter and jelly, they're probably throwing a good portion away of whichever the part is that they don't want. Next one, Cheetos Lip Balm. This one came out in 2005, and it's really now a novelty. It didn't sell very well, you know, and the question is, what would have been the requirements surrounding a Cheetos lip balm? You know, that I love Cheetos so much that I want to taste it on my lips for hours, right? I want orange lips. Who knows what they were after when they came out with that. But again, you can still find it in some of the novelty stores, as odd as that may seem. How about the Pet Rock? Unbelievably successful. So Gary Dahl came out with that in 1975. He sold 1.5 million of these for about $3.95. So I think about the operational scenario around that, right? I'm lonely, I need a pet that I don't need to feed or water. I want one I can put in my pocket that I can take anywhere. And again, unbelievable the success of that particular product. And I remember it from my childhood, and I know I'm aging myself here, and we just went out and back in our backyard and we created our own rocks with paint. But what a brilliant idea. And then the last one, the dog waste station. Now, to me, this is one of the best inventions ever, right? It could have been driven by many different people, dog owners, non-dog owners, park rangers, people that patrol the beaches, right? It appeals to many different audiences because of the function it provides. And I'm sure there are requirements around both the trash repository, around the bag dispensary, as well as signage, how it sets in the ground. And so you look at that, and to me, I think it's a brilliant product, and one that the innovation on that, whoever would have thought you could take your dog for a walk, and in many places that you go, there's a pet waste station that you can go to. So again, it sells for a little over $100, and they're everywhere nowadays. So in closing, the most successful innovations are filling a gap, providing a solution, or enhancing an experience. So by utilizing systems engineering, the probability of getting it right increases significantly. And if you remember the 3 C's, which again are capabilities, characteristics, and constraints when creating your requirements, and then validating those requirements so you know that you are going in the right direction and creating a solution that will be successful, that's what you're after. Again, take the doggy waste station, right? Who'd have thought 5 years ago that they'd be everywhere, that people would actually start to rely on them for providing a repository for dog waste, right? So that others can have a more pleasant experience. To me, that's innovation. Thinking ahead, sometimes creating a need, but having something that's successful that people want. So that concludes my presentation, where we can now open it up for questions. So Dawn, do we have everybody on mute?
Yes. They can. What approaches have you found to be useful in identifying requirements?
So for me, it's really important to go out and talk to customers, talk to potential users, and find out what are their needs today, right? And if there's a similar product, what does that similar product provide and what doesn't it provide? So if you can ask probing questions about what their needs are, that's your best bet. The other part of that is, so that gets the customer side. When you want to look at the internal side in terms of your own business where you may find constraints, is taking that innovation idea, that basically whatever it is that you're looking at, and then getting requirements from the internal team of what they need in order to make it successful. So really, just as doing a QFD is a team sport, identification of requirements is a team sport, and you really need to look at and ask for input. Other questions?
What level of detail or granularity is best when defining, refining requirements?
So if you think about the different points made of going through for verifiable, concise, unambiguous, you want to make sure that as you look at your product, right, you're covering all of the features and all of the elements within that product. So for example, let's say you're going to do a book, right? A book has a cover. A book has pages, right? A book has illustrations. A book has chapters. It's got page numbering. It has, you know, if you're going to put the title of the book on every page, it has margins. You want to think about every detail associated with that product and make sure that you understand what the requirement is to make it successful. If you leave out requirements, you're going to know when you start to do that implementation, because anything that you're guessing at means you have a missed requirement. hopefully that answered that question. Other questions? So Dawn, do we have any other questions out there?
Lori, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. So it was a technical issue, I guess. So the next question is, are there good templates you recommend for the tools mentioned or the full process?
So the ones that I showed, the rubric I basically created myself. If you go out on basically Google and you look for rubrics and you look for QFDs, you can take and modify those. There's some very intricate QFDs that you can pull down off of the internet that are level 1, level 2, level 3, and then you have to modify them for your use. I find that the simplest tools most of the time are ones where I either pull from Excel and adapt from there. There's a lot out on the internet, and I would start there. And if you don't see what works best for you, absolutely improvise and make one that suits your needs. Because as I look at, and I'll back up on my slide here, as I look at the QFD, right? So this is nothing more than an Excel that I modified, and I didn't put the house on top where you can do more of the correlations. Because again, if I want to get just a quick look at where I'm missing something, or where there's, like I said, where there's a missing requirement, or where there is a missing how or what, I don't need the top to get that correlation. I can use that if I really want to go in depth, but typically some of these quick tools work so much easier, and I typically create or modify as I go.
Thank you very much. The next question that has been posted is, how do you integrate defining requirements with product development? Are they sequential?
So what we look at is we start with really what's the end goal that we're after. So even I'm going to stay on this slide because it'll be easier to talk to, right? So if we start with the what's, it is your technology team or your development team that is going to really have to come up with those hows. And as they do that, they typically are going to have a pretty good understanding of, unless it's a brand spanking new product that they've never done anything like it before, they're going to have some good subject matter expertise about how they have done similar products in the past, and where they have lessons learned and where they have best practices. So as they go through and write their requirements and go down, start from a system level to a subsystem, down to a functional, even to implementation requirements, they're going to rely on some of that subject matter expertise. And so understanding and getting clean what requirements and then how you're going to implement those, or what are you going to do to implement it from for example, removable blades, right? That's going to have several layers of requirements that go with it, right? The mechanism for attaching them, the mechanism for removing them, right? How you would handle those once removed. There's going to be serviceability requirements that go with that, right? Because most of the time the reason you're going to have removable blades, and this again is where context comes into play, is why would you remove the blades from your lawnmower? Well, either to A, sharpen them, or B, get either more industrial blades or less industrial blades. You want a different material. Let's say you've broken a blade, right? So if you think about why would you want to remove the blades, then you can get into greater detail in lower level requirements from an implementation side for, okay, when we figure out the blades and how we're going to remove them, right, what do we want the user to be able to do? So a lot of it is just thinking in layers of those requirements, and your technology team or development team has to think about how would we implement that. So hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes for questions and answers. You can post your questions in the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. If there is no more question, I would like to thank you very much again, Lori, for accepting to be our speaker this evening. And thank you all again for joining this webinar, and have a good evening.
All right, thank you. Hopefully it was valuable for you all.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye.